Hello and welcome to Ask the Dice Maker. I'm Sasha, the master dice maker behind Sunshadeau Arts, and I'll be your guide into this journey of the world of handmade resin dice. Now, today on Ask the Dice Maker, I'm going to be answering a more personal question someone had asked, and they wanted to know how I got started as a dice maker. So, I'm going to warn you, this is not scripted. I'm just going to go off the cuff and try to answer this question. And it's also a little bit of a journey, so you might as well sit down and get comfortable. Because it's not a short and easy answer. So, hey Sasha, how did you get started as a dice maker? Well, it's a long story. So I've been an artist and designer for a really long time, and I used to be a scenic designer for theater, specifically. And when I was in my mid-30s, I decided to go back to grad school for scenic design because I wanted to be able to teach. I wanted to be a professor in a university. And about halfway through grad school, I was diagnosed with a couple of degenerative spinal conditions. The best explanation I've heard is that it's sort of like having arthritis in your spine. So, not really an unusual diagnosis if you're like 70. Really, really weird when you're in your 30s. And so a lot of the treatments they have don't really work for it because it's things like surgery, but the surgery only lasts 10 years, and stuff like that. So, that's a whole nother topic of conversation though. And then right after I got this diagnosis, I was in a car accident and I have a bunch of nerve damage all through like my whole right side. So like the whole side of my face, my whole shoulder and my whole right arm. And of course I'm right-handed. So because of the nerve damage, I have a lot of problems. Like sometimes my hand just spontaneously drops what it's holding. All on its own. After breaking half the glasses in my house, I now always use mugs with handles or plastic cups, like a child. I lost a lot of fine motor control and a lot of strength in my dominant hand and things like that. And so I was really struggling because, especially right after the accident, I couldn't hold a paintbrush. I couldn't hold a pencil, so how did I create with that sudden limitation? And so I started doing acrylic pouring as sort of like a therapeutic sort of, this is an art I can do. It's like you dump paint into a cup, you dump the cup up out onto a surface. I can do that, right? I can dump a cup, I can do that. So I started doing poured acrylic. And how you seal poured acrylic is that you put a layer of clear resin over the top. So that was like my introduction to resin, was just clear coating these acrylic pieces that I had made. And I had so many people who would come over and see my poured acrylic pieces and they were like, you need to sell these. Like, these are really cool, you should sell them. And I'm like, well, they're just gathering dust in my attic because I'm making them and not doing anything with them. So I decided to start Sunshadeau Arts. And I made a little Etsy shop, and it was just a hobby business. I would do it like 5 hours a week. I would make these poured acrylic things. I would sell them in the shop. Just, as therapy, really, as I was like coping with being disabled. And then I kind of decided, well, I'm getting sick of making coasters and things like that. So I was like, what kind of nerdy stuff? I'm a huge nerd. I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I was trying to figure out, like, how can I bring those two things together, right? So I started making dice trays and dice boxes with these poured acrylic designs. And that was kind of when Sunshadeau Arts started to take off. And I started to really, like, sell a lot of stuff. And then I started to, increase the amount of time that I spent doing it because all of a sudden I was like, oh, I'm making a little money. First the idea was to make enough money to pay for the supplies so I could keep doing it. But then it actually kind of started into a decent little side business. So that was kind of how Sunshadeau Arts was born and how it started getting nerdy because I was making dice trays and dice boxes. And then I ended up deciding to leave grad school before I finished, to be blunt, because my graduate program was not supportive of individuals with disabilities. And I was sick of getting treated like crap. So I decided to leave grad school. And the idea, I was like, oh, I'm going to hang up Sunshadeau Arts. I'm going to go get a real job. That was a fun little thing. And then right around the time that I decided to leave grad school, I was approached by the Rook and the Raven company. Hint, they're owned by my brother and sister-in-law. We're a big nerdy family. And they were like, hey, we're doing a Kickstarter. Would you make some trays for our Kickstarter? So I designed a bunch of custom trays and dice boxes that coordinated with the covers of their products, because they sell gaming notebooks. And then, of course, their Kickstarter exploded. So, I was thinking, oh, I'll make 20 dice trays. It ended up being 100 that I made for this Kickstarter. And so I was like, okay, well, good. This is a nice summer job. I have enough money and enough work to make it through the summer. Perfect. When fall comes, I'll go get a real job. And then I had been developing these traveling dice boxes and gaming cases and things like that. They're little briefcases and stuff. So it was like my dice chests that I was making, but they were portable, briefcases and stuff like that. And so I'd been kind of developing that idea, and I was like, well, I'll do a Kickstarter, and it's gonna fail, but I just at least need to get this idea out there. It's in my head. I need to get it out there. It's only really financially viable if I do it in bulk. So I was like, oh, I'll just run a little Kickstarter. It's gonna fail. No big deal. Well, the Kickstarter didn't fail. My first Kickstarter is funded 300 or 400% or something like that, which was shocking to me because I was absolutely convinced it was gonna fail. And I did it because I was convinced it was gonna fail. Imposter syndrome gets to us all, right? And so then it didn't fail. So I was like, okay, well, I'll work on fulfilling this Kickstarter. And then once it's fulfilled, then I'll quit Sunshadeau Arts and I'll go get a real job. And then while I was doing that, I kind of took my first little baby steps into dice making because I wanted to make, I knew about resin. I've been working with resin a lot, and I wanted to try pouring resin in 3D. And so I made dice for my D&D party. So I made a bunch of handmade dice as Christmas presents for my D&D group. And they're not great dice, but I had fun, and it was just a fun little thing. And then I also had started developing resin dice trays, my circular resin dice trays that I still sell. I don't sell the chests anymore, but I started developing these circular dice trays, and I was like, you know what? This is a cool idea, but I need a pressure pot and things like that to really do this. So I'm going to do another Kickstarter to fund a pressure pot so I can get a pressure pot and I can keep doing this as a hobby. So I made a second Kickstarter that was supposed to just be dice trays. And I kind of literally last minute before I launched the Kickstarter was like, wouldn't it be cool if I just made a couple of sets of dice that matched the trays just for funsies? So my first dice that I made for sale were just for funsies. And so then I was like, oh, you know what? And then there was such a good response online that I was like, oh, well, I'll just throw it on as a little add-on to the Kickstarter. The Kickstarter that's about dice trays. I'm just going to throw on these dice as a little extra bonus thing. The Kickstarter that's going to fail. Because, of course, I'm convinced every time I launch something, it's going to fail. And then not only did the Kickstarter not fail, but it funded 400% or whatever. So it did really well, much larger than I ever anticipated. And everybody wanted dice, which I was not remotely prepared for. Because I'm like, this is a dice tray Kickstarter with some extra dice just for funsies. And then everybody bought dice. And all of a sudden, I'm making hundreds of dice. And then, so during all of this process, I had moved to a different state. And my new studio space was significantly smaller than my previous one. And I just didn't have the space, the square foot, because I was going to close Sunshadeau Arts and I wasn't going to do it anymore. So I didn't locate a space that was big, right? Because I wasn't going to be doing it anymore. And so then I didn't have the space to like do these trays anymore. And because my dice were so popular from that Kickstarter, I was like, well, maybe I'll just keep doing dice instead, because it doesn't take up as much space as doing trays. So that was when I kind of started focusing more and more on dice. And the more I focused on dice, the more something clicked. Like I just knew, oh, I'm really good at this. Oh, this is really interesting to me. Oh, look at all the possibilities here. And at this point, I was still thinking, after this project, I'm going to quit and get a real job. I was still thinking this at this point. Even though I was running a decently successful business, I was convinced after every project, okay, I'm going to quit and I'm going to go get a real job. So it was C2E2 of 2020. It was right before COVID hit. And I was like, oh, I'm going to have an opportunity to show my dice in person. I'd been invited by Rook and the Raven again to come and just sell some dice in their booth and hang out for C2E2. And it was the first time I had ever been to a convention as a seller. And I was just like, you know what? I want to make something for me. I want to make something that celebrates something that I love. I love Critical Role. Critical Role was so key in getting me back into gaming after I hadn't been gaming for several years. And I mean, Sunshadeau Arts wouldn't exist without Critical Role. They were kind of instrumental in me getting back into gaming and starting kind of a nerdy gaming company. It was just that spark of inspiration, and I love the show so much, and it means so much to me. And so I decided I was going to make some Critical Role inspired dice just as a passion project for myself. And I was working like crazy hours. I was like working till like 3:00 in the morning because I was like, I want to get these dice finished before C2E2 so that I can just like bring them and share my love, and like Critical Role was gonna be at C2E2, and I was like, this would be a really great place to just show off my love for them, with them being there and everything. And so I made, my original Tea of the Dead and the original Consume Embrace dice, the big Titan dice that are like this big, and they weren't even done, y'all. They weren't even finished. I had literally, so the first video of Consume Embrace that went on the internet, I had literally pulled it out of a pressure pot at 4 a.m., took this really shitty video of it in my kitchen under the little light in the kitchen because I didn't want to turn the lights on because it was 4 a.m. and I didn't want to wake anybody up in the house. And I threw it on the internet before I ran down to the convention center to start setting up our booth. And then got finished with, was on break and popped on Twitter to see that it had exploded. That the video had just exploded everywhere. And then because so many people had seen it online, when they came by a lot of people came by the booth to come see the die in person. And these were, I was not planning on selling these. Like I wasn't making them for any type of business thing. I just made them because I loved the show and I wanted to make something. And I really wanted to push my skills as a maker. And then, it's like, I ran out of business cards in the first day of the convention because again, like I always think I'm going to fail and then I'm really surprised when I don't. So, and that was kind of like what sort of like catapulted me as a dice maker, was I just made something that I loved and people really responded to it. And I got to meet Todd, who I had no idea who he was. And he like came by the booth and was like looking at the dice and we were chatting. And then he left and he comes back a little while later and he's like, hey, can my guy film your dice? And I was like, oh, sure. Still had no idea who he was. He walks away. He comes back a little while later and he's like, hey, can I interview you? And I was like, okay. He's like, okay, meet me in the corner in a little bit. And I was like, okay. And then at this point, my brother comes up to me and he's like, do you know who that is? I was like, I don't know who that is. And he's like, that's the creative director of D&D Beyond. And I was like, ooh, goodness. I had no clue who he was the entire time we were talking about dice and Critical Role. Yeah, so then he interviewed me and it went up on D&D Beyond. And then that kind of like, it was like someone just pushed me down a cliff, and then it was just like a free fall tumble where all of a sudden like Sunshadeau Arts just exploded over all of this stuff. And it was shortly after that I realized, hey, maybe I'm not gonna fail. Maybe this is my real job. Like, because I kept, every time I was like, oh, after this project, I'm gonna quit and get a real job. And then it was like, basically that's the summer of 2020. And I was like, you know what? This is my real job. Like, I'm gonna own this now and be like, this is my real job. I'm not a failure. This is not going to fail. I am a dice maker now. And that was how I became a dice maker. I had no plans to be a dice maker. I had no idea of being a dice maker. I just fell into it ass backwards like I do everything in my life. And I think kind of the moral of the story in a lot of ways is, one, don't give up on yourself. Like, it's hard to find that self-confidence, and imposter syndrome is a real thing. And like I said, like I always thought I was going to fail and then was surprised when I didn't. It's like, believe in yourself. Like, believe in yourself. You have more to offer the world than you might think. And sometimes it's really hard to get started, and it's really hard to find your audience, and it's really hard to find your like niche. Like for me, it took a long time before I realized that what I wanted to make is that I wanted to make scenic dice and landscape dice. Like I wanted to make little miniature worlds with inside dice. And that was what like my heart was calling me to. And it took, I was making dice for over a year or two, maybe 2 years before I realized that that was my thing. Like that was my calling and that was what I wanted to do. And once I realized that that was what I wanted to do, and I made dice that just spoke to me as a person and that really celebrated things that I loved, that was when I started to find professional success. So, believe in yourself, trust yourself. You have, stuff to offer. Try to kick that imposter syndrome to the corner. If you're an artist, that's a real job. Yeah, number 2 is art is a real job. So don't be like me thinking I was going to go get a different real job. Like, you can be a successful, independent artist and maker. It happens. It's a real thing. And just make what you love. Make what you're called to make, because that will always shine through. Don't just make things because you think it's what people want to buy. And don't make things because you think it'll be popular or because you think it's what people want. Make what you want to make. It's the if you build it, they will come. Make what you're passionate about, and then you will be able to find your audience. You'll be able to find your customers. And, for me, it's like I was successful when I started making what I loved. The end. I don't know how to end this, So hopefully that wasn't too horribly rambling as I just kind of off the cuff. Oh, whoa, this is like a 20-minute video. Yeah, I rambled a lot. But that is my long journey of how I became a dice maker. That's how I became a dice maker, y'all. How do I normally end these videos? That's it for this episode of Ask the Dice Maker. Until next time. Do you have a question you'd like to ask the Dice Maker? Drop it in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and check out other videos on the Ask the Dice Maker channel. If you want to check my credentials, feel free to visit www.sunshadowarts.com or find me on Twitter or Instagram @SunshadowArts.